All right, this week on the Setty Report, we're going to be going into some of the dangers of the spike protein that is just really not being covered by mainstream media. And again, we're going to be looking at the Washington Post and their misrepresenting of this whole story. Madhava, what do you got for us today on the Setty Report?
Well, once again, I'd like to refocus my attack on the Washington Post. Last time we talked about how they misrepresented the data with regard to cases and the unvaccinated population. That was pure bunk. And they've made themselves a very easy target for critical analysis because, once again, in this paper that I'm going to dissect, they are arguing for the need to vaccinate adolescents, which is a huge problem in my opinion, because this group of people represents the most robust individuals against COVID 19. And they attempt to offer a risk benefit analysis as to why parents should get their kids vaccinated. And let's just dive right into it. The title of their piece, which came out last month, in the month of May, was that it is the FDA authorizes Pfizer coronavirus vaccine for adolescents 12 to 15 years old. I want to bring your attention to how they try to make their argument. And it basically comes down to this particular paragraph where they say children rarely suffer serious bouts of COVID 19, the illness caused by the coronavirus. And then they admit that of the more than 581,000 COVID 19 deaths in the United States, only about 300 have been under the age of 18, a tiny fraction of the total. They admit that it's a very, very small part of the population of the people who have died. But, as they say, that exceeds the number of children who die in a bad flu season.
Right.
Is that true? Well, unless you go and check the reference, you would have to assume that, yes, well, it must be true. But if we go and look at the reference from the CDC, what they actually state is that the 188 deaths from the bad flu season in 2017 to 2018 was likely an undercount. In fact, they estimate that the actual number was closer to 600. 600, which is twice the number of COVID 19 deaths in this age group. What is the Washington Post doing? They're making their argument that the number of deaths was worse than a bad flu season, but in fact it was not. So avoiding death in this age group is basically their argument for the benefit of getting vaccinated. That does not hold true, and I would consider this to be either extremely sloppy journalism and research or a frank lie that was made for some other reason.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows what that might be?
Interestingly, I mean, a fact checker would dive in and probably say that that was misleading or missing context. Going off the CDC numbers and just kind of not even mentioning that 600 was something that is definitely misleading.
Correct. So now I'm going to take just a minute to talk about side effects and deaths, for example, from the vaccine versus the disease. And let's talk about the vaccine, right? Because that's what the risk is of getting vaccinated. What is the risk of getting vaccinated? And here, right away, we jump back into a problem that keeps coming up, which is we have no reliable data about the side effects or risks of getting vaccinated. Why? We don't have a reliable reporting system. What we have is something called VAERS, which the CDC themselves have admitted underreports stuff. That argument is being used against the vaccine cautionary sphere because they're also saying, well, it's self-reported, so these people are making up or exaggerating the effects of the vaccine. And how are we to know whether it was really from a vaccine or whether they just developed myocarditis, for example, just out of nowhere, or blood clots out of nowhere? So what I'd like to do just for a moment here is to focus on something that is undeniably related to vaccines in terms of a deleterious effect, which is something called anaphylaxis. Anaphylaxis is a life-threatening situation that involves cardiovascular collapse and respiratory compromise because of a allergic response to what was introduced to the body. This happens within minutes after being vaccinated. So there's no way to deny that if you have anaphylaxis right after getting vaccinated, it's due to the vaccine. I'm sorry, that's the way it is. So with flu vaccines, the CDC reports that that happens about 1.3 times out of a million doses administered. They further admit that with those rates are higher with the COVID-19 vaccine, suggesting it's somewhere between 2 to 11 out of a million. However, that number is also an underestimate. And the reason why we know this is that a very interesting study was done by the Mass General Brigham Health System here in Boston that looked at their employees, over 60,000 of them that got COVID-19 vaccines. And they surveyed all of them, and they got about 52,000 responses. And again, we're talking about healthcare providers or people in the system. So we have a very reliable group of people that are talking about what happened to them. Now, about 2% of them developed some sort of allergic response. 16 of them actually developed anaphylaxis. Okay? 16 out of 52,000, that's about 247 per million. Okay? This is almost 200 times the rate of anaphylaxis compared to a flu vaccine. It's inescapable. Why isn't the Washington Post talking about it? I don't know. Why isn't the mainstream media talking about it? I don't know. This is the most reliable piece of data we have that ties the vaccine to a life-threatening condition. Agreed, it is still a very low number. So we're only looking at anaphylaxis here. Now I'd like to bring our attention to a much more concerning situation with the COVID-19 vaccine. And this has to do with how the vaccine is intended to work. So as a very brief recap, we hopefully know by now that the vaccines introduce mRNA into our cells that allow us to produce the spike protein. The spike protein is the means by which the SARS-CoV-2 virus enters our cells and infects us. The idea, of course, is that if we teach our immune system to recognize the spike protein, we will then be immune to COVID-19 or the SARS-CoV-2 virus. What has come up recently in a very elegant experiment is a clear demonstration that the spike protein itself is toxic. How is this done? Well, they created what's called a pseudovirus, which is a virus, a viral particle that has spike proteins on its surface. And they administered this to animal models and demonstrated that these animals would come down with COVID-like sequelae or symptoms where you had blood clotting and heart problems and neurological issues and basically a whole body kind of response to the spike protein itself. This is a pseudovirus. It has no viral RNA or DNA in it. It only has spike proteins. This is irrevocable proof that the spike protein itself causes disease. Furthermore, they've now demonstrated the molecular pathway by which spike protein causes injury to vascular endothelial cells. Now, the vascular endothelial cells are the small cells that line your blood vessels. Are people seeing clots with COVID-19? Yes. This is why we have to take this information very, very seriously. Because right from the get-go in the pandemic, people who are on the front lines realized that this was not simply a viral pneumonia, where people would, have lung problems, can't breathe, congestion. They were dying of blood clots. They were dying of strokes. They were dying of heart attacks. Why? Well, back then we didn't know, but now we have a pretty clear answer. The spike protein is causing these things. That's why these people were presenting in the way that they presented. So now we have a clinical correlation with the science, with the molecular pathway. The spike protein is toxic. Why is this a problem? It is an enormous problem for this reason. What if, after being injected with the vaccine, you don't develop an immune response and create antibodies to the spike protein? We know this happens. This happens with vaccines all the time. Just because you get vaccinated, say with hepatitis B, you don't necessarily gain immunity. They check you for antibody titers. If you don't have any, you get a booster. That's how it works. The difference is here is that if you don't develop an immune response to the hepatitis B vaccine, you don't end up with hepatitis B. You're just as healthy as you were before. In this situation, if you don't develop an immune response to the spike protein, you now have spike proteins circulating throughout your body causing injury. Now, I'm not saying this is going to happen with every single person who gets inoculated. There's probably going to be a distribution of people that do just fine, people who have suffered devastating consequences from the vaccine. So that is something that should honestly sound alarms in all of our governing institutions that are commanding us to get vaccinated. How are we supposed to deal with this? Now, I would like to demonstrate and provide to you another piece of critical information that has to do with the biodistribution data that was recently released through the Freedom of Information Act through a Japanese medical regulatory agency by a group of international research scientists. This is table 2.6.5.5b, pharmacokinetics, organ distribution. Now, pharmacokinetics is a term that means where does something go after it gets administered to a person. Okay, so what is the biodistribution of the vaccine? Now, in this particular study, they weren't looking at the vaccine, they were looking at the identical lipid nanoparticle that is being used to deliver the mRNA to our cells. So we can safely say that wherever the lipid nanoparticle goes, so does the mRNA that creates the spike protein, and therefore that is where the spike protein goes. The spike protein, again, is proven now to be toxic to cells. And as you can see here, it goes pretty much everywhere, from adipose tissue, which is your fat, to your adrenal glands, your bones, your kidneys, your large intestine, your liver, your lung, your brain, and there is significant accumulation in your ovaries and spleen. Now put this all together. We have the spike protein that is toxic. We have a vaccine that's being delivered through lipid nanoparticles that goes everywhere. And where the vaccine goes, so does the spike protein. So this should be yet another huge red flag to the vaccine community and to the vaccine manufacturers and to the CDC and the FDA. Why wasn't this particular piece of information relayed to us in the Washington Post article that is suggesting that the risk-benefit analysis should, in fact, make us vaccinate our kids? To me, there's a huge risk of inoculating tens of millions of kids, knowing what we know now.
And I think the challenging part about this, as I'm listening to you, is I'm thinking to myself, well, how widespread is this, right? So how widespread are these potential organ issues? Should they be immediate? Might these issues show up in a month or two after a person's been inoculated? These are all like big questions that I initially have, thinking like, well, how do we even show that this is a widespread problem that should be concerning versus, well, it's happening in such an isolated percentage of the population that it's probably not that big of a deal. And I think I'm assuming at this point we just don't have enough data to really make any form of meaningful conclusion on that. But do you feel we have enough science and perhaps anecdotal cases that points to a real cause for perhaps even stopping or delaying the use of these vaccines?
We absolutely do. In fact, there is a request by an agency in the UK asking the equivalent board in England to the FDA to stop vaccinations because there is enough information in their equivalent database called Yellow Card that demonstrates what we're seeing in our own database in the United States with VAERS. So, like, legitimate scientists and researchers are pleading our institutions to stop the vaccination program. How long will this take? I do not know. But this is where it gets very confusing, right? It's like We have the pro-vaccine community saying you can't trust VAERS because it's self-reporting. The number of deaths justifies broad vaccinations. But on the other hand, we now have a molecular mechanism by which the spike protein is proven to be toxic. We have a biodistribution study that demonstrates that the vaccine goes to places that it wasn't supposed to go to. And we have a self-reporting system that demonstrates 60 times the number of deaths with the COVID-19 vaccine compared to flu vaccines in the past. And we haven't even talked about the other adverse reactions. And the reason why I don't want to do that is because there's too many things to talk about here. And of course we can say, well, this is, it's unreliable data. But let's just take a moment here. We have a mechanism that demonstrates why the spike protein is dangerous to us. We have a study that demonstrates that the spike protein is being created in parts of our body that was unintended. And we have a huge number of, relatively huge number of reported adverse reactions. So at what point do we say, holy cow, we need to stop and take a closer look at this? I think that time is right now. And if anything, we should at least excuse our children from this until we know more.
That's
right?
That's well said. I mean, hopefully something gets done. And unfortunately, Washington Post articles like the one you mentioned here are not helping the cause. But, this was yet another powerful Setty report. Thanks so much for doing this one this week.
Yeah, thanks for being with me, Joe, and thanks for platforming this kind of information. Let's stay sharp, everybody.
Thanks so much for watching this video. As you can probably imagine, censorship and demonetization has made things incredibly difficult for independent media to survive. We basically rely solely on you to make sure we keep doing what we're doing. If you want to support our work and support this important mission as well, consider becoming a CE member. Basically, you get access to a whole bunch of different member benefits that we have. You can check out the link in the description to become a CE member and learn more about the benefits and, of course, support this work. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you next time.